Bear cub was caught in a net, dragged behind a speedboat. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning sun painted Crystal Lake in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the water's surface. 17-month-old Riley sat in her stroller near the sandy shore. Her tiny fingers wrapped around a colorful rattle that she shook with pure delight. Her mother, Savannah Reed, was setting up their picnic blanket just a few feet away, humming softly as she unpacked sandwiches and juice boxes. "Look at those pretty ducks, sweetie," Savannah said, pointing toward a family of mallards gliding across the calm water. Riley giggled and clapped her hands, her bright blue eyes following the gentle ripples the ducks left behind. The peaceful morning was suddenly shattered by the aggressive roar of a speedboat engine. The sound grew louder and more intrusive as a sleek white boat came racing around the bend, its bow cutting through the water like a knife. 3 young men were aboard, laughing loudly and passing around what looked like beer cans, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. Savannah frowned as she watched them zoom past, creating a wake that sent the duck family scrambling for safety. "Some people have no respect," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She glanced at Riley, who had stopped playing and was now staring intently at the lake, her little face scrunched up in concentration. The boat made a sharp turn about 100 yards from shore, sending spray flying in all directions. That's when Savannah noticed something odd trailing behind it. At first, she thought it might be a water ski rope or some kind of fishing line, but as the boat continued its reckless path, she realized it was something much larger. Riley suddenly dropped her rattle, the plastic toy landing in the sand with a soft thud. The baby's eyes were fixed on the water, and she began making soft cooing sounds, pointing her chubby finger toward the lake. Her expression had changed completely from playful joy to something that looked almost like concern. "What is it, baby girl?" Savannah asked, following her daughter's gaze. The boat was now making another turn, and whatever was being dragged behind it was creating its own wake. As it came closer to shore, Savannah's heart nearly stopped. Tangled in a large fishing net being pulled behind the speedboat was a small, dark shape that was definitely not debris. It was moving, struggling, desperately trying to keep its head above water. It was a bear cub. Riley began to cry, but not the typical fussy cry of a tired toddler. This was different, urgent, almost demanding. She pointed again toward the water, her little voice growing louder and more insistent. Other families scattered around the beach area began to look over, initially annoyed by the sudden noise, but then following the baby's desperate gestures toward the lake. "Oh my God," whispered Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been feeding birds nearby. She squinted toward the water, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she was seeing. "That's a baby bear." The speedboat continued its wild ride, the 3 men aboard completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in their wake. The cub's small paws flailed frantically as it tried to swim, but the net was wrapped tightly around its body, and the boat's speed made it impossible for the exhausted animal to break free. Riley's cries grew more intense, and she began rocking back and forth in her stroller, her tiny hands reaching out toward the water as if she could somehow help the struggling cub from 50 yards away. Tears streamed down her little cheeks, and her distress was so palpable that several adults began running toward the shore to get a better look at what had captured the baby's attention. Connor Adams, a park ranger who had been patrolling the area, heard the commotion and jogged over to investigate. When he saw what was happening in the water, his training kicked in immediately. "Someone needs to stop that boat," he shouted. reaching for the whistle around his neck and blowing 3 sharp blasts. But the speedboat was too far away, and its engine was too loud for the occupants to hear the warning. The bear cub was weakening. Its struggles were becoming less frantic and more desperate, its small head barely staying above the churning water. The net seemed to be tightening around its body with each passing second, and foam from the boat's wake was making it even harder for the little animal to breathe. Riley's cries had now attracted a crowd of nearly 20 people, all watching in horror as the helpless cub fought for its life. But the baby wasn't just crying anymore. She was making specific sounds, almost like she was trying to communicate something urgent to the adults around her. "Listen to her," said Michael Hayes, a local fisherman who knew these waters well. "It's like she's trying to tell us something." As if responding to his words, Riley suddenly stopped crying and pointed directly at a thick stand of trees on the opposite shore. Her little voice made a series of soft grunting sounds, and she bounced in her stroller with renewed urgency. That's when they saw the massive brown shape emerging from the forest. The mother bear had arrived, and she had spotted her cub in the water. The massive bear stood at the water's edge, her powerful muscles tensing as she watched her baby struggle against the cruel net. She was easily 400 pounds of pure protective fury, her dark brown coat glistening in the morning sunlight. Her eyes, filled with a mother's desperate love and growing rage, tracked the speedboat's erratic path across the lake. Riley stopped making noise completely. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than her previous cries. She sat perfectly still in her stroller, her wide blue eyes moving back and forth between the struggling cub and its mother on the distant shore. It was as if the 17-month-old baby understood the gravity of the situation better than most of the adults around her. "We need to get that boat's attention right now," Connor Adams said, his ranger training taking over. He pulled out his emergency flare gun and fired a bright red flare high into the sky. The brilliant light streaked across the morning air, but the 3 men in the speedboat were too busy laughing and drinking to notice. The mother bear began pacing along the shoreline, her massive paws leaving deep prints in the mud. She let out a low, rumbling growl that carried across the water, a sound so primal and heartbreaking that it made several people in the crowd step back instinctively. The bear's maternal instincts were at war with her natural fear of the deep water. Bears could swim, but not well enough to catch up to a speeding boat. Jessica Brooks, a marine biology student who had been studying the lake's ecosystem, suddenly ran up to the group. She had been observing from her research station further down the shore when she heard the commotion. "That cub can't last much longer," she said breathlessly. "The net is cutting off circulation to its back legs. Look how it's struggling to keep them moving." She was right. The bear cub's movements were becoming more erratic and weak. What had started as powerful swimming strokes were now desperate, uncoordinated splashing. The fishing net, heavy with water and tangled with lake weeds, was acting like an anchor, pulling the exhausted animal down. Riley suddenly made a sound that no one had ever heard from her before. It wasn't crying or babbling. It was almost like a low whining noise, similar to what the mother bear was making. Savannah looked down at her daughter in amazement. "Riley, sweetheart, what are you trying to say?" The baby looked up at her mother for just a moment, then turned back toward the lake and made the same sound again, this time louder and more insistent. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. There was something almost supernatural about the way this tiny human child seemed to be communicating with the wild animals. Michael Hayes had been thinking fast. As a lifelong fisherman, he knew these waters better than anyone. "There's a small motorboat tied up at the Martinez dock, about 200 yards that way," he said, pointing east along the shoreline. "If we can get to it quickly, we might be able to intercept that speedboat before." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. before the cub drowned. "I'll go with you," Connor said immediately. "I have bolt cutters in my ranger kit. We can cut through that net if we can get close enough." As the two men started running toward the Martinez dock, something extraordinary happened. Riley began making a series of different sounds: short barks, long whines, and soft grunting noises. Each sound seemed deliberate and purposeful. More remarkably, the mother bear across the lake appeared to be responding. The massive bear had stopped pacing and was now standing completely still, her head tilted slightly as if she was listening to something. When Riley made a particular whining sound, the mother bear would make a similar noise back. When the baby made short barking sounds, the bear would huff in response. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist who had been having a quiet morning walk when she was drawn to the commotion. "Babies that age don't have the cognitive development to understand complex situations like this, let alone communicate with wild animals. But Riley was doing exactly that. And somehow, her strange communication was having an effect on both the mother bear and, incredibly, on the struggling cub in the water. The bear cub, who had been weakening rapidly just moments before, seemed to find a second wind. Its paddling became more coordinated, its head stayed higher above water, and it began making small crying sounds that carried across the lake. Sounds that were answered immediately by both Riley and the mother bear. Avery Johnson, a local news reporter who had been at the lake gathering footage for a story about summer recreation, had her camera rolling and was capturing every moment of this unprecedented interaction. She had never seen anything like it in 15 years of journalism. "The baby seems to be encouraging the cub to keep fighting," she said quietly into her microphone, barely believing the words as she spoke them. "And the mother bear is responding as if she understands that this human child is trying to help save her baby." The speedboat, meanwhile, continued its reckless journey around the lake. The three occupants, college-aged men who appeared to be heavily intoxicated, were completely unaware of the drama playing out in their wake. They had turned up their music even louder, and empty beer cans were scattered across the boat's deck. Logan Carter, a local sheriff's deputy who had just arrived on the scene after receiving multiple 911 calls, was already on his radio calling for backup and emergency marine rescue. But he knew that help might not arrive in time. "The lake patrol boat is 20 minutes out," he announced to the crowd, "and the Coast Guard helicopter is 30 minutes away." A collective groan went up from the gathered people. 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours for the exhausted bear cubs struggling in the net. That's when Riley did something that made everyone stop talking and stare. The baby girl somehow managed to unbuckle herself from her stroller. At 17 months old, she had never shown any ability to work the safety straps before, but somehow she had freed herself. She slid down from the seat and began crawling rapidly toward the water's edge, making urgent crying sounds that seemed to carry a message of desperate determination. "Riley, no!" Savannah cried, lunging forward to catch her daughter. But the baby was surprisingly quick and determined. She reached the water's edge and sat down in the shallow water, her little hands splashing as she continued making her strange communication sounds toward both the struggling cub and its mother. The effect was immediate and stunning. The mother bear, who had been growing more agitated by the minute, suddenly plunged into the lake. Despite her species' limited swimming ability, the massive bear began paddling determinedly toward the center of the lake, following the path of the speedboat. Her powerful strokes created waves that radiated outward in all directions. At the same time, the bear cub seemed to understand that help was coming. The little animal's struggles became more focused and efficient. Instead of wasting energy with panicked thrashing, it began using deliberate movements to keep its head above water while trying to work free from the net. Riley, sitting in the shallow water with her mother holding her protectively, continued her mysterious communication. Her sounds had become softer now, almost like she was offering comfort and encouragement rather than urgent warnings. "This is scientifically impossible," Dr. Rodriguez said, but her voice was filled with wonder rather than disbelief. "But I'm watching it happen." Michael Hayes and Connor Adams had reached the small motorboat and were frantically working to get it started. The engine coughed and sputtered, clearly not having been used in weeks. Come on," Michael muttered, pulling the starter cord again and again. Finally, the engine caught and roared to life. The two men jumped into the boat and began racing across the lake toward the speedboat, which was now making another wide turn that would bring it closer to where the mother bear was swimming. But they weren't the only ones who had spotted the bear in the water. One of the men in the speedboat, the one sitting in the back seat, happened to glance behind them and saw something that made him scream in terror. "Dude, there's a giant bear swimming right at us." The driver spun around to look, nearly losing control of the boat in the process. When he saw the massive brown bear paddling determinedly in their direction, he panicked and gunned the engine to maximum speed. This sudden acceleration created a catastrophic problem for the bear cub. The net, which had been dragging at a manageable pace, was now being pulled so fast through the water that the cub was completely submerged. Only the very tip of its nose remained above the surface, and even that was disappearing beneath the waves. Riley's soft comfort sounds immediately changed back to urgent, desperate cries. She began trying to stand up in the shallow water, reaching toward the lake as if she could somehow help the drowning cub from 100 yards away. The mother bear, seeing her baby disappear beneath the surface, let out a roar of pure anguish that echoed across the entire lake. The sound was so powerful and heartbreaking that several people in the crowd began crying openly. Dr. Rodriguez knelt down next to Riley, studying the baby's behavior with professional fascination, mixed with personal amazement. "She knows," the psychologist whispered. "Somehow, this child knows exactly what's happening out there, and she's trying to coordinate a rescue." As if to prove the doctor's words, Riley suddenly pointed toward the approaching motorboat with Michael and Connor, then toward the swimming mother bear, then back to the submerged cub. Her little voice made a series of short, sharp barking sounds that seemed to carry across the water. Amazingly, both the mother bear and Connor Adams seemed to understand. The ranger, who had been heading directly toward the speedboat, suddenly changed course to intercept the swimming bear. At the same time, the mother bear altered her swimming direction to meet the rescue boat halfway. "I think the baby is telling them to work together," Avery Johnson said into her camera, her voice filled with awe. A 17-month-old human child is somehow coordinating a rescue operation between a park ranger and a wild bear to save her cub. But even with this unprecedented cooperation, time was running out. The bear cub had been underwater for nearly 30 seconds, and its small body was no longer visible at all beneath the churning waves created by the speeding boat's wake. Riley's cries reached a pitch that seemed to cut through every other sound on the lake. But then, something miraculous happened. The baby's desperate sounds were joined by another voice, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the forest itself. An enormous male bear, easily twice the size of the swimming mother, emerged from the dense woods on the eastern shore. His massive frame cast a shadow that stretched far into the water as he stood on his hind legs, assessing the situation with intelligent, dark eyes. This was clearly the cub's father, and his arrival changed everything. The male bear's presence had an immediate effect on the speedboat's occupants. The driver, already panicked by the sight of one swimming bear, now saw an even larger bear on the shore, and completely lost his nerve. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, causing the boat to skid sideways across the water's surface. The sudden direction change created a massive wake that rolled across the lake in all directions, but it also did something unexpected. It loosened the fishing net's grip on the submerged cub. The little bear's head suddenly broke the surface, gasping desperately for air as the net shifted around its body. Riley immediately stopped crying and made a series of quick, excited barking sounds. The mother bear, still swimming strongly toward the rescue boat, seemed to understand that her baby had resurfaced. Her swimming became even more determined, her powerful strokes cutting through the water with renewed purpose. Connor Adams, standing in the bow of the motorboat with his bolt cutters ready, could now see the cub's location clearly. "There!" he shouted to Michael, pointing toward the struggling animal. "It's about 50 yards ahead of the mother bear." Michael gunned the engine, but he had to be careful. The lake was now chaotic with multiple wakes crossing each other, the speedboat careening wildly as its drunk driver tried to avoid the swimming bear, and the massive father bear beginning to enter the water from the eastern shore. Dr. Rodriguez, still kneeling beside Riley in the shallow water, was documenting everything with her phone. As a child psychologist, she knew she was witnessing something that would challenge everything science understood about infant cognitive development and animal communication. "The baby is doing it again," she called out to the crowd. Riley had begun making a new sound, a rhythmic pattern of short and long calls that sounded almost like Morse code. It's like she's giving instructions, and incredibly, both parent bears seemed to be following those instructions. The swimming mother bear suddenly dove underwater, disappearing completely beneath the surface. At the same moment, the father bear, who had been entering the water slowly and cautiously, suddenly plunged in completely and began swimming with powerful strokes toward the center of the lake. "What are they doing?" Savannah asked, holding her daughter close, while trying to understand the coordinated movements of the wild animals. Jessica Brooks, the marine biology student, had been watching the water currents and wave patterns. "I think I understand," she said excitedly. "The baby is telling them to approach the cub from different angles. If the mother comes from underwater and the father from the surface, they can sandwich the speedboat between them and force it to slow down." The theory seemed impossible, but that's exactly what was happening. The speedboat driver, now completely terrified by the sight of two massive bears converging on his location, cut the engine and began screaming for help. His two companions were equally panicked, one of them frantically trying to call 911 on his waterlogged phone, while the other was attempting to untangle the fishing net from the boat's stern. With the boat finally stationary, Connor and Michael were able to reach the bear cub within minutes. The little animal was exhausted and barely conscious, its small body tangled so tightly in the net that it looked like it might be seriously injured. "Hold still, little guy," Connor said softly, beginning to cut through the thick rope with his bolt cutters. The cub's eyes were open but unfocused, and its breathing was shallow and rapid. "We're going to get you free." As Connor worked to free the cub, the mother bear surfaced just 20 feet away from the rescue boat. Her massive head broke through the water, and she treaded in place, watching anxiously as the human worked to save her baby. There was no aggression in her posture, only desperate hope. The father bear had also reached the area and was swimming in slow circles around the speedboat, effectively trapping the three drunk men who were now completely sober and terrified. His presence ensured that the boat wouldn't start moving again and endanger the rescue operation. Riley, watching from the shore, had become completely calm. She sat peacefully in her mother's arms, making soft cooing sounds that seemed to provide comfort to everyone within hearing distance, humans and bears alike. "Got it," Connor announced as the last strand of net fell away from the bear cub's body. The little animal was free, but it was clearly too weak to swim on its own. Its legs were cut and bleeding from the tight rope, and it was shivering uncontrollably from exhaustion and shock. Without hesitation, Connor gently lifted the cub into the boat. The mother bear immediately swam closer, making soft grunting sounds that were clearly expressions of gratitude. She kept pace with the boat as Michael slowly navigated toward shore, never taking her eyes off her rescued baby. The father bear followed at a distance, still keeping the speedboat surrounded until he was sure his family was safe. As the rescue boat approached the shore, something extraordinary happened that no one had expected. Riley, still in her mother's arms, began singing. It wasn't words, she was too young for that, but it was definitely a melody. A soft, lilting tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. The injured bear cub, lying in Connor's gentle arms, lifted its head at the sound of the baby's song. For the first time since the rescue, the little animal's eyes seemed to focus clearly. It looked directly at Riley and made a soft chittering sound in response to her melody. "My God," whispered Logan Carter, the sheriff's deputy who had been coordinating the emergency response. "It's like they're talking to each other." Dr. Rodriguez was frantically taking notes, trying to document every aspect of this unprecedented interaction. "The baby's song seems to have a calming effect on the injured animal," she observed. "Heart rate appears to be stabilizing. Breathing is becoming more regular." As the boat reached the shallow water near shore, the mother bear also arrived. She stood up in the chest-deep water, towering over everyone as she looked down at her injured cub. Her eyes met Riley's for a long moment, and something passed between them. An understanding that transcended species barriers. Riley stopped singing and made one more sound. A soft, gentle whimper that seemed to say, "Everything will be okay now." The mother bear responded with the quietest, most tender sound anyone had ever heard from such a massive creature. It was barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the water to where Riley sat with her mother. Connor carefully handed the bear cub to Jessica Brooks, who had experience handling wild animals through her marine biology studies. "We need to get it to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center immediately," she said. "The cuts from the net aren't too deep, but it's severely dehydrated and exhausted." As Jessica wrapped the cub in a soft towel, the little animal continued to make small sounds toward Riley. The baby responded with gentle coos, maintaining their mysterious communication even as the distance between them grew. The mother bear followed Jessica up onto the shore, keeping a respectful distance but never losing sight of her baby. Her massive paws left deep impressions in the sand as she walked, but her movements were careful and deliberate, showing no aggression toward the humans who had saved her cub. The father bear had finally left the speedboat and was swimming toward shore as well. The three men in the boat, now free from their ursine guard, quickly started their engine and raced toward the nearest dock, eager to escape before the authorities arrived to cite them for reckless boating and animal endangerment. But Logan Carter was already on his radio, giving the Coast Guard the speedboat's registration number and description. "They won't get far," he assured the gathered crowd. "Reckless endangerment of wildlife is a federal offense." As the excitement began to die down, people started to notice something odd about Riley's behavior. The baby, who had been so animated and communicative throughout the entire rescue, was now becoming increasingly quiet and sleepy. Her eyes were droopy, and she was leaning heavily against her mother's chest. "The adrenaline is wearing off," Savannah said, stroking her daughter's hair. "She's exhausted. I don't think she understands what she just did." But Dr. Rodriguez wasn't so sure. She had been observing Riley carefully throughout the entire incident, and there were aspects of the baby's behavior that couldn't be explained by typical child development patterns. "Mrs. Reed," she said carefully, "has Riley ever displayed any unusual behaviors before today? Any signs of advanced cognitive abilities or unusual sensitivity to animals?" Savannah thought for a moment. "Well, she's always been very calm around animals. Our neighbor's dog adores her, and she never cries at the zoo. But nothing like this. This was... She paused, searching for words. This was like she could understand what the bears were thinking. Jessica Brooks, still holding the bear cub, looked over at Riley with wonder. "The cub keeps looking toward her," she observed. "Even injured and traumatized, it seems drawn to your daughter." Indeed, the little bear's eyes were fixed on Riley, who was now nearly asleep in her mother's arms. Every few seconds, the cub would make a soft sound, and Riley would unconsciously respond with a gentle sigh or murmur, even in her drowsy state. The mother bear, meanwhile, had settled down on the sand about 20 feet away from the group of humans. She was lying on her side in a relaxed position, but her eyes remained alert and focused on the scene before her. It was clear she felt no threat from these particular humans, the ones who had saved her baby. When the father bear finally reached shore, he shook the water from his massive frame and approached his mate and cub. The reunion was tender and touching, with both parent bears gently nuzzling their injured baby while making soft rumbling sounds of comfort. Riley stirred in her mother's arms and opened her eyes briefly. She looked toward the bear family, smiled sleepily, and made one last soft cooing sound before drifting off to sleep completely. The response from the bear family was immediate and unmistakable. All three bears, mother, father, and injured cub, made quiet sounds in return, as if saying goodbye to the remarkable human baby who had orchestrated their reunion. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. "In 30 years of studying child psychology, I've never seen anything remotely like this," she said. "This baby displayed cognitive abilities and interspecies communication skills that shouldn't be possible at her age." Avery Johnson, who had been filming the entire incident, lowered her camera with tears in her eyes. "I've covered thousands of stories," she said quietly, "but I've never witnessed anything as beautiful and mysterious as what happened here today." As Jessica prepared to transport the bear cub to the wildlife center with the parent bears following at a careful distance, Connor Adams couldn't help but look back at the sleeping baby in her mother's arms. "That little girl saved a life today," he said. "Somehow, she coordinated a rescue operation between humans and wild animals that shouldn't have been possible. She's a hero." But even as the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis was over, questions remained. How had a 17-month-old baby understood the complex situation unfolding on the lake? How had she been able to communicate so effectively with wild bears? And why did the connection between Riley and the bear family seem to go so much deeper than simple animal empathy? The answers to those questions would have to wait. For now, it was enough that a small life had been saved, a family had been reunited, and everyone present had witnessed something that would change their understanding of the connections between all living creatures. As Savannah carried her sleeping daughter back to their car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger and more mysterious than. 3 days later, Savannah was sitting in her kitchen, watching Riley play with her toys on the living room floor when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she could see Dr. Rodriguez standing on her front porch, holding a manila folder and looking unusually serious. "Dr. Rodriguez," Savannah said as she opened the door. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "Mrs. Reed, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," the psychologist said. "But I've been doing some research since the incident at the lake, and I've discovered some things that I think you need to know about your daughter." Savannah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of things? Dr. Rodriguez glanced toward Riley, who had stopped playing and was now looking directly at them, as if she understood that the conversation was about her. "May I come in? This is going to take some time to explain." They settled in the living room, with Riley continuing to play nearby, but clearly listening to every word. Dr. Rodriguez opened her folder and pulled out several photographs and documents. After what happened at the lake, I couldn't stop thinking about Riley's behavior, she began. So I did some research into similar cases of unusual animal-human communication in young children. What I found was disturbing. She spread out several black and white photographs on the coffee table. Each one showed a young child, roughly Riley's age, surrounded by various wild animals: wolves, deer, birds, even big cats. In every photo, the animals appeared calm and protective around the children. These photographs were taken between 1920 and 1975 at various locations around the world, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Each child displayed the same abilities that Riley showed at the lake: the ability to communicate with and coordinate wild animals in crisis situations. Savannah picked up one of the photos, studying the image of a small boy sitting peacefully among a pack of wolves. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Children this young don't have these kinds of abilities." "That's what I thought too, Doctor," Rodriguez said. "But here's where it gets more interesting and more concerning. I was able to track down information about what happened to these children as they grew older." She pulled out a thick file of documents. Every single one of them disappeared before their 3rd birthday. Some were reported as missing during family camping trips. Others simply vanished from their own backyards. In every case, the last time they were seen, wild animals were nearby. Savannah's face went pale. She looked over at Riley, who had abandoned her toys completely, and was now sitting quietly, staring at the photographs with an expression of recognition that seemed far too mature for a 17-month-old. "You're trying to scare me," Savannah said, but her voice was shaking. "These could be fake photos, or coincidences, or—" "There's more, Doctor," Rodriguez interrupted gently. "Yesterday, I received a call from Jessica Brooks, the marine biology student who helped with the bear cub rescue. She wanted to update me on the cub's condition." Dr. Rodriguez paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "The bear cub is healing remarkably well, much faster than should be medically possible. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that every morning since the rescue, the entire bear family has been returning to the lake, specifically to the area where your picnic was set up." "What do you mean, returning?" "They sit there for hours, Mrs. Reed. The mother, father, and cub just sit on the shore, looking toward the road that leads to this neighborhood. Park rangers have been monitoring them, and their behavior is completely unprecedented. Wild bears don't exhibit this kind of longing behavior." Riley suddenly stood up and walked over to the window that faced toward the lake. She pressed her small hands against the glass and made a soft whimpering sound, the same sound she had made during the rescue. "She knows they're there," Savannah whispered, watching her daughter's behavior with growing alarm. "Somehow, she knows." Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Mrs. Reed, I think your daughter may be what some indigenous cultures call a bridge walker, a person born with the ability to communicate across species barriers. It's an extremely rare phenomenon, and according to the historical accounts I've found, it always leads to the same outcome. Which is? The child eventually chooses to leave their human family and join the wild community that has accepted them. It's not kidnapping or tragedy. It's a calling that they can't resist." Savannah felt like the room was spinning. "That's ridiculous. Riley is just a baby. She doesn't understand complex concepts like choice or calling." But even as she said the words, she was remembering things. The way Riley never cried at the zoo. how their neighbor's aggressive dog became gentle as a lamb around her daughter. The time last month when a family of deer had stood in their backyard for an entire afternoon, seemingly waiting for something. Riley made another soft sound at the window, and incredibly, from somewhere in the distance there came an answering call. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of a bear cub calling back. Dr. Rodriguez and Savannah looked at each other in shock. "The lake is over 2 miles away," the psychologist said quietly. "There's no way sound could carry that far, and no way a human baby could hear it even if it did." But Riley had heard it. She began making a series of soft calls toward the window, and each one was answered by distant sounds from the direction of the lake. It was like listening to a conversation in a language neither adult could understand. "Mrs. Reed, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Dr. Rodriguez said urgently. "Has anyone in your family ever displayed unusual abilities with animals? Your parents, grandparents, anyone?" Savannah thought carefully. "My grandmother used to tell stories about my great-great-grandmother, who lived in the mountains of North Carolina. She said the old woman could call deer out of the forest just by humming, and that bears would never attack anyone in her family. But those were just stories, family legends." What was her name? Elizabeth Clearwater. But everyone called her Singing Bear Woman because— Savannah stopped, her eyes widening. "Because she could make sounds that bears understood." Dr. Rodriguez made rapid notes in her folder. "Mrs. Reed, I think the ability has been passed down through your family line, but it skipped several generations before appearing in Riley. This explains why it's manifesting so strongly in her." Riley suddenly turned away from the window and walked directly to Dr. Rodriguez. The baby looked up at the psychologist with eyes that seemed far too knowing for her age, then placed her tiny hand on the folder of photographs. Without warning, Riley began to make the same sounds she had made at the lake. The complex series of calls that had somehow coordinated the bear rescue. But this time, the sounds were coming from inside the house, and they were answered not just by distant bears, but by what sounded like multiple animals from different directions. A chorus of responses echoed through the neighborhood. Dogs began howling. Birds started an elaborate symphony of calls. From the nearby park there came the sound of what might have been deer or elk making their distinctive vocalizations. "Oh my God," Savannah breathed. "She's calling to all of them." Dr. Rodriguez was frantically scribbling notes, trying to document every aspect of what was happening. "Mrs. Reed, I think Riley is announcing something to the animal community. I think she's letting them know where she is." The sounds from outside continued for several more minutes, with Riley responding to each animal voice in what seemed like a structured conversation. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost deafening. Riley walked back to her toys as if nothing unusual had happened, but she kept glancing toward the window with an expression of anticipation. "What do we do now?" Savannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez closed her folder and looked directly at Savannah. According to the historical accounts, the children usually make their choice during a significant emotional event, often when they feel called to help animals in crisis. Riley has already demonstrated her abilities publicly. Word is going to spread about what happened at the lake. What kind of word? There were dozens of witnesses, Mrs. Reed. Avery Johnson's news report has already been picked up by national outlets. By tomorrow, there will probably be scientists, reporters, and curiosity seekers trying to find Riley. And if my research is correct, that kind of attention often triggers the final calling. As if summoned by their conversation, Savannah's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with a 202 area code, Washington, D.C. "Don't answer it," Dr. Rodriguez advised quickly. If I'm right about what's happening, Riley is about to become the subject of intense scientific and media scrutiny, and based on the historical pattern, that's exactly when the children disappear. But Savannah was no longer listening to the psychologist. She was staring out the window in shock. Standing in their front yard, calm as could be, were 7 deer. They weren't grazing or moving through the area. They were standing perfectly still, all facing toward the house, toward Riley. "Dr. Rodriguez," Savannah said quietly, "I think you need to see this." The psychologist looked out the window and nearly dropped her folder. "This is happening much faster than I expected," she said. "In the historical cases, it usually took weeks or months for the animals to start gathering. But then again, none of those children had Riley's level of ability." Riley had noticed the deer, too. She toddled over to the front door and began making soft cooing sounds toward it. Outside, the deer responded with gentle vocalizations of their own. "They're waiting for her," Savannah realized with growing horror. "They're waiting for her to come outside." The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a local number that Savannah recognized. It was Connor Adams, the park ranger who had helped rescue the bear cub. She answered hesitantly. "Hello?" "Mrs. Reed, this is Connor Adams. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm calling with some urgent information about the bear family from the lake rescue." "What about them?" "They've left the lake, ma'am, all 3 of them. Our tracking equipment shows they're moving through the forest in a direct line toward your neighborhood. They should reach your area within the next few hours." Savannah felt her knees go weak. "Why are they coming here?" "We're not sure, but it appears to be connected to your daughter's interaction with them at the lake. Mrs. Reed, I need to ask you to keep Riley inside until we can figure out what's happening. We've never seen behavior like this from wild bears before. Connor, there are already 7 deer in my front yard, and my daughter seems to be communicating with them." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Mrs. Reed, I'm going to send some backup to your location immediately. Something very unusual is happening, and we need to make sure everyone stays safe." As Savannah hung up the phone, she realized that Dr. Rodriguez had been packing her folder with urgent efficiency. "Where are you going?" Savannah asked. "To get help," the psychologist replied. "Mrs. Reed, based on everything I've learned, your daughter is about to face a choice that will determine the rest of her life. The animals are gathering because they sense that she's ready to fulfill her destiny as a bridge walker. What choice? Whether to stay with her human family or answer the call to join the wild community that has accepted her as one of their own." Riley, who had been quietly playing during this entire conversation, suddenly looked up at both adults with an expression of perfect understanding. For just a moment, her baby features seemed to mature, and she looked like someone much older and wiser than her 17 months. Then she smiled, made a soft sound toward the window where the deer were still waiting, and returned to her toys as if the fate of 2 worlds wasn't hanging in the balance. 20 minutes after Dr. Rodriguez left, Savannah's quiet afternoon turned into chaos. The first sign of trouble was the sound of helicopters. Not just one, but 3 different aircraft circling overhead at varying altitudes. Through her living room window, she could see news vans pulling up along the street, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Riley seemed completely unbothered by the commotion. She continued playing with her colorful blocks, occasionally looking toward the front door where the deer were still maintaining their vigil. If anything, the baby appeared more content and peaceful than Savannah had seen her in days. The doorbell rang repeatedly, followed by insistent knocking. Voices called out through the door, reporters wanting interviews, scientists requesting access to study Riley, and officials claiming to represent various government agencies. Savannah ignored them all, keeping the curtains drawn and hoping they would eventually give up and leave. But the situation outside was escalating in ways she hadn't anticipated. Connor Adams arrived in his park ranger vehicle, followed closely by 2 sheriff's deputies and what appeared to be a team of wildlife specialists with tranquilizer equipment. Through a crack in the curtains, Savannah watched Connor approach the deer in her front yard with extreme caution. The deer didn't flee as wild animals normally would when humans approached. Instead, they turned to look at Connor with what seemed like mild curiosity, then returned their attention to the house. It was as if they were waiting for permission from someone inside before they would consider leaving. Savannah's phone rang again. This time it was her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, calling from the house next door. "Savannah, dear, are you and Riley okay?" the elderly woman asked. "There are reporters knocking on my door asking questions about your daughter. They're saying she can talk to animals?" "We're fine, Mrs. Chen. We're just staying inside until things calm down." "Well, you might want to know that there are more animals arriving. I can see them from my upstairs window. There's a family of raccoons sitting on your back fence, and I swear I saw a red fox in your backyard about 10 minutes ago." Savannah felt her heart sink. "How many animals are there now?" "At least a dozen that I can see, and more keep coming." "Oh my goodness, there's an owl perched on your chimney in broad daylight. That's very unusual behavior for—" Mrs. Chen's voice trailed off, and Savannah could hear her sharp intake of breath through the phone. "Mrs. Chen, are you still there?" "Savannah, you need to look out your back window right now. There's something you need to see." Savannah carried Riley to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. What she saw made her legs weak with shock. Standing at the edge of her backyard, just beyond the wooden fence that bordered the small forest preserve, were the 3 bears from the lake. The mother, father, and their injured cub were sitting calmly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The cub, which should have been resting at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, looked completely healed and alert. But they weren't alone. Arranged in a rough semicircle around the bear family were at least 20 other animals: deer, raccoons, squirrels, several foxes, a family of rabbits, and what looked like a small pack of coyotes. They were all facing toward the house, all waiting with the same patient expectation that the deer in the front yard had been showing. Riley saw them too, and immediately pressed her small hands against the kitchen window. She began making the soft communication sounds that had become so familiar, and incredibly, the entire gathering of animals responded in unison. The sound was like nothing Savannah had ever heard. A chorus of different animal voices creating a harmony that seemed almost musical. "Mrs. Chen," Savannah said weakly into the phone, "I think you should stay inside your house for a while." "Oh dear, this is much more serious than I thought. Should I call animal control?" "No," Savannah said quickly. "Please don't call anyone. Riley seems to have some kind of connection with them, and I don't want anyone to get hurt trying to disperse them." As if hearing her mother's words, Riley looked up at Savannah with those impossibly knowing eyes and made a questioning sound. It was clear that the baby was asking for something, but Savannah couldn't understand what. Riley walked to the back door and stood in front of it, looking up at the handle that was far beyond her reach. She made the questioning sound again, more urgently this time. "She wants to go outside," Savannah realized with horror. "She wants to go to them." The knock on the front door was different this time, more authoritative and persistent. Through the peephole, Savannah could see Connor Adams standing there with 2 people she didn't recognize. One was a woman in a dark suit who looked like a federal agent, and the other was an older man carrying what appeared to be scientific equipment. "Mrs. Reed, this is Park Ranger Adams," Connor called through the door. "I have some specialists here who need to speak with you about your daughter's safety. This situation is becoming dangerous for everyone involved. Savannah reluctantly opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. What kind of specialists? The woman in the suit stepped forward. Mrs. Reed, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. This is Dr. William Thornfield from the Institute for Animal Behavior Studies. We're here because the gathering of wild animals around your home represents an unprecedented situation that could pose serious risks to public safety. The animals aren't hurting anyone, Savannah protested. They're just waiting. Dr. Thornfield consulted a tablet computer he was carrying. Mrs. Reed, we've been monitoring the situation via satellite imagery and wildlife tracking devices. In the past hour, we've documented over 40 wild animals converging on this location from a radius of nearly 10 miles. This kind of coordinated animal behavior has never been scientifically observed before. What does that mean? Agent Martinez answered. It means your daughter may have triggered some kind of biological phenomenon that we don't understand. For everyone's safety, we need to study what's happening and find a way to disperse the animals before the situation gets out of control. Riley, who had been listening to the conversation from her position by the back door, suddenly let out a sharp cry of distress. It wasn't her normal baby crying. It was the same urgent sound she had made at the lake when the bear cub was in danger. Immediately, the response from outside was overwhelming. Every animal within a quarter-mile radius began vocalizing at once. The sound was so loud and intense that car alarms started going off up and down the street. The news crews outside began backing away from their equipment, and several of the wildlife specialists took defensive positions behind their vehicles. "What's happening?" Agent Martinez shouted over the cacophony. "Riley's upset," Savannah called back. "I think she can sense that you want to separate her from the animals." Dr. Thornfield was frantically taking readings on his equipment. "The acoustic levels are off the charts," he announced. "Whatever communication system is at work here, it's far more sophisticated than anything we've seen in nature before." The animal chorus continued for nearly 5 minutes before gradually dying down to silence. When it finally stopped, the quiet was almost eerie. Riley had stopped crying and was now sitting peacefully by the back door again, but her expression had changed. She looked sad and resigned, like someone who had just received disappointing news. Connor stepped closer to the door. "Mrs. Reed, I need to be honest with you. The governor has been briefed on this situation, and there's talk of declaring a state of emergency if the animal gathering continues to grow. We're trying to handle this quietly, but if more animals keep arriving, we may have to take more drastic measures." "What kind of drastic measures?" Agent Martinez exchanged a look with Dr. Thornfield before answering. "Tranquilizing and relocating the animals, possibly establishing a quarantine perimeter around your home, and potentially placing your daughter in protective custody while we study her abilities." "You want to take Riley away from me?" "We want to understand what's happening here before someone gets hurt," the agent replied. "Mrs. Reed, there are now news crews from 4 major networks outside your house. The story about your daughter has gone viral on social media. By tomorrow morning, there could be hundreds of people trying to get close to her. That's not safe for Riley, for you, or for the animals that seem to be protecting her." Savannah felt trapped between impossible choices. She looked back at Riley, who was still sitting by the back door with that expression of sad understanding. The baby looked up at her mother and made a soft sound that seemed to convey both love and apology. "I needed time to think," Savannah said finally. "I'm afraid time is something we don't have much of," Dr. Thornfield interjected. "Our satellite data shows more animals en route to this location. Large animals. We've identified at least one black bear family, a small wolf pack, and what appears to be a mountain lion moving through the forest preserve toward your neighborhood. The implications of his words hit Savannah like a physical blow. You're saying dangerous predators are coming here because of Riley? We're saying your daughter appears to have some kind of influence over animal behavior that extends far beyond normal human-animal interaction, Agent Martinez explained. And while the animals seem peaceful now, the presence of natural predators in a suburban neighborhood creates risks we can't ignore. Riley suddenly stood up and walked over to where Savannah was standing by the front door. The baby reached up and tugged on her mother's shirt, then pointed toward the back of the house where the animals were gathered. She wants me to see something, Savannah realized. Against her better judgment, and ignoring the protests of the officials at her front door, Savannah picked up Riley and carried her to the back window. What she saw there made her question everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The animals in her backyard had arranged themselves in a very specific pattern. The bears sat in the center, surrounded by the deer and smaller mammals, with the foxes and coyotes forming an outer perimeter. But it wasn't random, it was clearly organized, like a council meeting or some kind of formal gathering. And they were all looking directly at the window where Riley was standing. The bear cub, now completely recovered from its ordeal at the lake, rose to its feet and walked to the edge of the fence. It looked up at Riley and made a series of soft sounds that were clearly directed at her. Riley responded immediately, making her own complex series of calls back to the cub. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other animals occasionally adding their voices to what was obviously a structured dialogue. "My God," Savannah whispered, "they're actually talking to each other." Dr. Thornfield, who had been listening from the front door, called out urgently, "Mrs. Reed, we need to document this interaction. What you're witnessing could revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence and communication." But Savannah was beginning to understand that this wasn't about scientific discovery. This was about choice. Riley's choice. The conversation between Riley and the animals continued for another few minutes, then gradually came to an end. When it was over, Riley looked up at her mother with an expression of profound sadness and made a sound that Savannah had never heard before. A soft, mournful cry that seemed to carry the weight of impossible decisions. Outside, the animals began to move. Not dispersing, as the officials hoped, but reorganizing. They formed what looked like a processional line leading from the backyard into the forest preserve. The bear family took positions at the front of the line, while the other animals arranged themselves by species behind them. They were preparing for a journey, and it was clear they expected Riley to join them. Riley walked back to the door and stood there, looking between her mother and the assembled animals. For the first time since this all began, she looked like what she was, a confused and conflicted baby facing a choice that no child should ever have to make. The knock on the front door came again, more urgent this time. "Mrs. Reed, we have a problem," Connor called out. "The animals aren't just gathering anymore, they're organizing for movement, and our perimeter teams are reporting that more large predators are approaching from multiple directions." Savannah realized with growing dread that the moment Dr. Rodriguez had warned her about was arriving much faster than anyone had anticipated. Riley was about to be forced to choose between the human world that had raised her and the wild community that was calling to her soul. And from the look in her daughter's eyes, Savannah was beginning to fear which choice Riley would make. The tension in the air was suffocating. Savannah knelt down beside Riley, her heart breaking as she watched her baby daughter struggle with an impossible decision that no child should ever face. The little girl looked between her mother's tear-filled eyes and the patient animals waiting beyond the glass, her tiny hands pressed against the window. "Mrs. Reed, we need an answer," Agent Martinez called through the door. "More predators are arriving, and we can't guarantee anyone's safety much longer." Riley made a soft whimpering sound and reached up to touch her mother's face. For a moment, she was just a normal baby seeking comfort from the person who loved her most. But then her expression changed, becoming that eerily mature look that seemed far beyond her 17 months. The bear cub at the fence made a gentle calling sound, and Riley responded with her own soft vocalization. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, with the cub's mother and father joining in with deep, rumbling voices that carried across the yard. When it ended, Riley looked up at Savannah with tears in her bright blue eyes. She pointed toward the door, then back to her mother, then toward the animals. The message was clear. She understood what was being asked of her, and she was trying to find a way to choose both worlds. But that's when something miraculous happened. The bear cub suddenly walked right up to the back door and sat down, placing one small paw against the glass. Riley immediately put her tiny hand up to match the cub's paw, with only the thin barrier of glass between them. And then Riley began to sing. It was the same wordless melody she had sung at the lake, but this time it was different, stronger, more purposeful. The sound seemed to carry emotions that transcended language: love, gratitude, promise, and goodbye, all woven together in a hauntingly beautiful tune. One by one, every animal in the gathering began to respond, not with their individual calls, but with harmonized sounds that complemented Riley's melody. The bears added deep, resonant notes. The deer contributed high, clear tones. The smaller animals filled in with delicate accompaniment. Even the approaching predators still hidden in the forest added their voices to the incredible chorus. The song lasted for nearly 10 minutes, growing stronger and more complex with each passing moment. People for miles around stopped what they were doing to listen to the most beautiful and impossible sound they had ever heard. A symphony of human and animal voices creating music that spoke directly to the soul. When it finally ended, the silence was profound. Riley stepped back from the window and looked up at her mother with a smile of pure peace. She had made her choice, and it wasn't the choice anyone had expected. The bear cub lifted its paw from the glass and took a step backward, then another. All around the yard, the other animals began to move as well, but not toward the house. They were turning away, returning to the forest preserve in the same organized manner they had arrived. The bear family was the last to leave. The mother and father bears stood up slowly, their eyes never leaving Riley's small figure at the window. The cub looked back one more time, made a soft sound that seemed to say, "Thank you," then followed its parents into the trees. Within minutes, all the animals had disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only trampled grass and the lingering sense of something magical that had touched the ordinary world. Riley walked back to her toys and sat down, picking up her colorful blocks as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But she was humming softly to herself, the same melody she had sung to the animals, the same melody that would become her constant companion as she grew up, a reminder of the choice she had made and the bridge she had built between two worlds. Savannah opened the front door to find Agent Martinez, Dr. Thornfield, and Connor Adams staring in amazement at the empty yard. "What just happened?" the agent asked quietly. "She chose love over fear," Savannah replied, tears streaming down her face. "She chose to be the bridge between our worlds rather than abandoning either one." Dr. Thornfield was frantically checking his equipment. The acoustic readings from that song, they're unlike anything in the scientific literature. It was as if every species was communicating in a universal language. Connor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. She didn't choose between being human or being wild. She chose to be both. She chose to be the connection that helps us understand each other. As the officials and news crews gradually dispersed, Savannah sat on the floor next to Riley, watching her daughter play with innocent joy. The baby looked up and smiled, making a soft cooing sound that somehow conveyed a message of infinite love and possibility. That evening, as Savannah tucked Riley into her crib, she noticed something that made her smile through her tears. Outside the nursery window, sitting peacefully in the oak tree, was a small owl, not threatening or demanding, just watching over them with gentle eyes. And from somewhere in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of a bear cub singing Riley's melody back to her. Riley fell asleep with a smile on her face, humming softly to herself. She had found a way to honor both her human family and her wild calling. She had become what the world needed most, a bridge of understanding in a world that had forgotten how to listen to the voices of all its children. In the years that followed, Riley would grow up to become exactly what her choice had promised. She became a renowned wildlife conservationist, a translator between human and animal needs, and a living reminder that love and understanding could overcome any barrier. But she never forgot that day by the lake, when a simple act of compassion had awakened a gift that changed everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, the animals of the forest would gather near her childhood home to sing her song back to the stars, remembering the little girl who chose to love both her worlds rather than abandon either one. The bridge had been built, and it would stand forever.